Today, what I'm going to talk about is my firm, and actually when I was working with Alan and the Products of Design department, I was a smaller firm. I was running my own practice, and then kind of an old employer of mine invited me to come back, kind of create a joint firm, and the name is TEN Arquitectos. The firm, we have an office in New York. We've been around, this firm's been around for about 15 years. I actually started the office originally when I first came to New York, and then I'd gone off on my own and met all the wonderful people at SVA. So I came back to this office about 6 or 7 years ago. And we also have an office in Mexico City, which was started, and hence kind of the name, 30 years ago. It's not like Three Amigos. It's TEN Arquitectos, which is Taller de Enrique Norton, so it's an acronym for my partner. But what you're going to see today is less an in-depth dive into a series of projects and more framing each project to really illustrate what drives us as architects, and especially what drives us as our firm. So for us, a very basic and constant preoccupation of our firm is the understanding, kind of the absolute professional commitment that we have to the public. In a world defined by migrations, and hopefully continued migrations, and urbanization, we seek to create a new urbanity in which public and private space are woven together. As you watch this talk and listen to this talk, I would love for you to see if you can find kind of the common thread, in this space and within the work. You won't see any other interior academic spaces or any office spaces, but I think, hopefully the common thread in the investigations are clear. Our work invests in the enhancement of the public realm as a crucial positive catalyst for change. What's important to note is that and I hope it's evident in the work that I'm about to share, is that this approach, this idea that architecture or design is a catalyst for kind of positive public change, it's not limited to large-scale urban projects. All too often I'll unfortunately hear from my peers, well, we can't really impact the public because it's a private developer, or we can't impact the public because it's private funding, it's private money, it's a gated, property. All of architecture is public. It all impacts. You work within the city, despite the fact that maybe not all of us will occupy that building. I'll hopefully live here another, 30 plus years. I will have not occupied 95% of the built environment in New York. That's not to say that everything doesn't in some way impact my experience and my life, within the urban fabric. So this is really to show that this responsibility to the public, this commitment, applies equally and sometimes even more significantly to small-scale community projects or infrastructural works. With an ever-increasing density, where is the opportunity for future public space in the city? To find these opportunities, we need to start by understanding the role of architecture and our responsibility as architects. And again, I would translate that to designers as a whole. And like I said before, all of architecture has a public dimension and must be attuned to the possibility of enhancing the civic relationships and the human experiences. Regardless of site, scale, program, or budget, we are not exempt from our responsibilities to the public at large. And what you'll see coming up, not every project will present the obvious opportunities for positive public impact. So during this talk, I'm going to show, like I said, a handful of projects and kind of illustrate, how we seek out these opportunities. Again, the ones that, I was actually answering a question earlier, about, what happens when the client doesn't want you, to listen to your ideas and wants a certain end result. Architecture, and again, I could translate this to design. Yes, we do solve problems, but we're not problem solvers. We're critical thinkers. And all too often, the real issue is not in answering the questions posed to you, but in identifying the right questions. And so again, in a lot of these projects, it was about stepping back and really asking what were the questions that applied. And how we engage the public realm in each of the projects and in all of our work Our work falls under 3 lines of investigation. Architecture as public space. By that, I don't mean that we're just talking about open public space. What I'm talking about is as an approach. As an approach to public space, our projects strive to connect people to people, people to the city, and to serve as a platform for social exchange. So how you can apply that to any typology, any program, any siting. Architecture as infrastructure. Again, I don't mean literal, but what I mean is architecture is an investment in infrastructure. It can deliver not only built work and programs, but also improved efficiencies and networks. Architecture must help connect people to resources, create new opportunities, and bring new public assets. So again, it's not just an object. It's not just a building set within this pre-existing context. And then the third is architecture as territory or landscape. Architecture is empowered to connect people to place and to culture, enriching or clarifying a sense of place that strengthens identity. So in jumping into these projects, all of different scale, locations, typology, Acapulco City Hall. When the client came to us for this project, again, what was asked of us was to create an office building. An office building for 37 government agencies, all of which would come together for the first time. There was limited budget, both for the construction as well as for operating the building. And given the siting in Acapulco, if you're familiar with that area, water is also a very scarce resource. So while the client came to us and asked us to build a building, again, we have a larger responsibility to kind of the collective. You can give one resource, which is a government center or a museum or a library or a classroom. That doesn't give you the, reason to maybe deplete another resource. We as architects aren't necessarily judging where one resource has more value than the other. So again, as all designers tend to do, we say, well, how much more can we take on and try to solve within this single project? So the site, this is actually the same image, but to the left you see the boundaries of the site. It is on this spectacular stretch of Acapulco Beach. Again, to put a closed, completely solid office building on this site would mean to remove this from the public realm. So again, you've got the idea that the site itself has always been a resource for the public. So this was a diagram that we did to really say, how would we keep the site still porous, still accessible to the public? But the fact of the matter is the government center has real security issues. This is not something that, again, is really a public. They do provide a public service. There are departments there that have interface that someone can go and get services, but this is not, a public park by any means. But how do you achieve that? So what we started to do, and these are kind of transformational massings, is we started to look at first how we could break down the scale. It's surrounded, and you can see kind of the light white lines, by a very small scale residential. So just the given was this very large program. We couldn't question how much program they needed because they needed to house all of these departments, but we could question how you make that mass fit within the larger context. So first we started to shift it around. The second was the idea of each of the government agencies, how would you bring natural light? Well, a typical typology is the courtyard. But again, the massing of that just seemed like this monumental thing that was kind of anti-contextual. So we started to study how you could break it down further, and the interesting thing was we realized in breaking it down further, not only did you start to reduce the overall feeling of the mass, but you started to give identity to the 37 agencies. Because yes, they are all part of this Acapulco Town Hall, but again, our belief is there's always kind of this interesting kind of tension and opportunity between the individual and the collective. And again, the empowering power that one has when you identify the idea that any collective, any community is a sum of parts, and how do you acknowledge both? And also in doing that, it started to open up opportunities for terraces and green space that then, it became kind of synergistic or like a kind of reciprocal relationship by which one department could start to occupy the green roof of the other. And then, you know, the other important thing that I didn't point out before was all of this is raised up slightly on a plinth. This was done such that the public can actually traverse the entire site, or so they believe. They think they have free access. They think they're actually accessing a public space, but the private entrances and kind of the secure are kind of tucked out of the way. So again, this notion of empowering the public to feel like this space is still theirs. It has not been privatized, but we still maintained all the necessary kind of security and secure processions. And then the final was acknowledging the fact that we could not deplete a resource of the water, acknowledging the fact that they did not have money to power this building, and again, you know, pay for these resources. We provided a canopy over the whole. Now in Mexico City, this is ideal because the weather is such that if you just provide shade, for the most part, you have outdoor space that you can use 365 days a year. So we couldn't add any square footage to the building because, again, the budget. So what we did was we provided public space, common space, terrace space, you know, informal meeting space, all those other things within the outside, while still maintaining kind of the limitations of what was the physical interior space we were allowed to build. So again, this kind of, no sophisticated graphics here, but you get the idea, you know, kind of the porosity at the ground floor, the stacking of the 37 department volumes, the idea that you create this kind of endless porosity, you know, between. And, you know, in many ways, and this is consistent with everything you'll see and hopefully even something you recognize within your own space, we feel that it's not about the object. Our job is always about creating the void, using architecture to sculpt the open space, to sculpt the shared space. You know, if it's not built, it's really the space owned by all. So here's a cross-section through, and again, you see kind of the interrelationship between this public realm, this common ground, you know, literally and figuratively, and then the agencies stacked up with the outdoor spaces. And then the canopy, just to give you a sense of scale, that's about 2 football fields. And in construction, what was interesting about this project, I'll say interesting as opposed to somewhat sad, is that the turmoil in the government in Acapulco, if you read any of the news, for a long time this project sat constructed but not occupied because the government was in an upheaval. The interesting thing about that, though, is that, you know, typically when you build a building, the building, everyone moves in, and then the landscape takes years to establish. So it always looks pretty pathetic because you've got, you know, the dirt and the trees are, you know, this high. In this project, because the building sat for such a long time, this is even before, we don't even have photographs yet of them moved in, although they are moved in, but you'll see the landscape established, and it really kind of took over the building, which was somewhat of a poetic. But you can see here, the interesting thing to note about the canopy is they are photovoltaic panels, solar panels. So the roof does 2 things. It provides 60% of the power for the building, and it also collects 90% of the gray water for the building. So again, what we did, you know, we were told that our role was to design the building, not to help them operate it, not to help them pay for the operation, but we recognize that if we did this in the beginning, we could actually add more value, you know, because again, you know, architects and designers really need to think about the longer term of what they put forth. You know, the idea that it isn't just about designing the physical, it's the social, the financial, you know, the historical, the cultural. I think, you know, any design problem is not about what applies. It's really about editing what doesn't apply, and you almost have to start in the reverse. And what's interesting, again, is the project came to us of build a kind of dumb office building, make it small, make it solid, make it secure, and in the end, it's become this kind of iconic public space for them. Again, what was asked of us, this is, if you're familiar with where MoMA is on 53rd between 5th and 6th. The red, you know, it's just across and in a very cultural context. This project, I think the next one illustrates it very well. It was originally an old library called the Donnell Library. In fact, I know it very well. That's where I went and studied for my architect's exam. I went there every weekend. I passed. But it was a well-loved library. It was a little dilapidated, and the New York Public Library sold the site to a developer. The community was not very happy. They weren't really kind of brought into that decision, or even kind of told that one day they were going to come to their beloved library and it was going to be locked. But anyway, they sold the site, and as you see happening all around New York City, these public-private partnerships, they sell the site to a developer. In turn, the developer builds some portion of it for the cultural entity. So what you're seeing here is, basically, this is our site, and that is what they built, the Baccarat Tower, hotel and I believe condos. And this is kind of the space we were left with. And then what we did have was space below ground. So when we started the project, I read in the New York Times that the library would be the cellar in a mall, which of course was horrifying to us that, we hadn't started the project, but that was what the community assumed they were being given. They had this larger library. It was reduced to basically, the base of this very private, very elite tower. And so, again, we asked ourselves, we were tasked with designing a library, but what did this space, what did this community really need? And we felt what it really needed was a public space, was civic space. And how would we design a library that first and foremost, it really read as an extension of the public realm? I'm sure everyone's familiar with the main branch on 42nd Street. And people look at this, and a lot of times they talk about the architecture of it, the classical architecture, the monumental architecture. Where I see the power is not in the architecture, but in this civic platform, in this civic landscape. Anytime, and I walk by this space twice a day, you see people protesting. You see people getting married, meeting up, having a sit-down class. It becomes this wonderful platform for exchange and change. And for us, that was what the library really should empower, because they were even asking themselves what was the relevance of a library, given the fact that we read off our phones, we can get any information within seconds. Where was the printed word? And we said, well, obviously the printed word is the history, the printed word is still very relevant, but it's really about exchange of information, getting information, exchange of information, and that information can come from people. That information can come from devices. So it's really just providing a place by which you can encourage exchange. And hopefully you see that in your space as well. So this is the concept section that we created. This is 53rd Street, so you see kind of the ghosted MoMA, to the right. The idea was, what if we didn't have a facade? I mean, it's not Mexico City, it's not Miami, so we needed a facade. But what if you could reduce the facade such that it wasn't about the monumental institution? It wasn't about identity as a thing, but the real identity was the community and the actions of that community. So what we did was we were given this concrete shell, after the developer kind of designed the tower, and we decided it would be really amazing if somehow all we did is put this thin glass facade on, as if the community kind of in a grassroots effort kind of took over the space. And literally you see the extension of this civic landscape. And even though our space was small already, we persuaded the New York Public Library, and it wasn't very hard because again, they really embraced this idea, to fold the slab down to create this kind of stepped seating that became an amphitheater and a gathering space and a dialogue. The library for us was like kind of a cultural mirror. So the idea that the occupants of the library would kind of be in direct dialogue with the residents and the visitors of New York City. So it was not only that move created the literal kind of continuity of this wrapping landscape inside, but again, kind of put the library in dialogue with its kind of urban context. So this is the kind of the renderings looking in. The red was our notion that, since the facade really didn't exist at the street, the idea was your eye would be drawn to the back, and we made the proposal that given MoMA, the library has to acknowledge that they're within a kind of a fairly strong cultural presence across the street. So they're in the process of commissioning an art piece to be brought to that back wall. And then from a design standpoint, again, because it wasn't about any interiority at all, we took exterior metals, which was this perforated zinc corrugated metal, and wrapped it in from both sides so that you really did feel that this was really more about the urban environment, and again, not about kind of an interior. And this is actually a photograph of the finished work. You'll see again, you can see someone walking out. There's actually a double glass layer so that you feel there's a portico condition, because again, we recognize that from day one, maybe not everyone embraces this idea of the library. They maybe much prefer the original idea of a library. And ours was not to say what was right. We were not putting forth, oh, this is the new idea of the library, take it or leave it. And so in fact, the library is actually made up of kind of many different, say, gradations of experience. You can go from this first entry, which is the most public, and if that's what interests you, to really just stay within this very large-scale public space, or again, through this open plan, which again, open plan does not mean lack of differentiation. Any good open plans actually mean just the opposite. Think of Central Park. It actually is about, finding your place, going from the most public of spaces to then seeking out the most private of study carrels in the back. But what we wanted to really do was deliver to them this public space that then again the library could do something better with, something more with. And so this started off as kind of a branch library where it would be about the repository of books, and it ended up being again this platform by which, here when we photographed, it was during the Olympics. So it was great that they were showing the Olympics. In fact, during the photo shoot, there were groups there that were cheering. There were groups that were crying because their team was losing. We tried to not get the crying people into photos. It didn't bode well for the architecture. But again, and it's this notion of kind of spectacle and community and overall engagement. Since opening, another important thing too was even the signage was very intentional. We wanted no signage on the building itself because again, signage denotes kind of a separation. Once you pass this line, you are inside. So we convinced them to actually put the signage perpendicular, and the original, sometimes your original intention, and then there's some portion of reality that deviates from your original intention. Sometimes that's even better, because originally we assumed that these panels would come with the sign painted on them, and they would hang them up. Because they were perforated and because they were corrugated and matched, there was no way to do that, because had they put the panels together, all the text would have been shifted. They would have never been able to align them. So we ended up constructing a scaffold just so someone could hand paint the sign. And as painful as that was to the contractor, it really lent, I think, what the feeling we were trying to achieve, which is, they kind of hung their hat there and they painted it. And again, it deinstitutionalized the space. So I felt like that was kind of the icing on the cake. But since opening, they host monthly operas. They have concerts, lectures, panel discussions, art exhibits. So again, you get that sense from the left. You're looking and you're seeing kind of one virtual reality, and above you've got the real reality. And for us, that really captured the New York condition. At any point, and I know when you have visitors coming from other places that aren't coming from urban environments, it's a weird sensation to realize that at any point someone might be above you or below you. And so this vertical kind of existence is something that we thought was quintessential to the city. The budget, again, was extremely limited. So all the materials not only tried to evoke the urban quality, but they're also very straightforward in terms of, wood floors. This is a cement coating, the durability of the metal panels. It's very important if you're giving a public space that materials show signs of time in a positive way. So things patina, not getting scuffed. So we avoided any use of sheetrock and any use of some other kind of typical indicators of interior space. The ceilings are perforated, expanded mesh. One thing to note, again, any given that doesn't seem like it's ideal is always an opportunity. Where you see the central volume, because again, this is all one open landscape, that's actually the elevator core for the residential. A huge piece that took a chunk out of the whole space, which was very troublesome to the library. And we said, well, again, wait a minute, this is an opportunity. If the new notion of the library is this open civic landscape where programming really defines what it is and people define what information is exchanged, maybe this little pavilion could be the old notion of the landscape. Because again, it started with the book. The book was the touchstone at the start, so we liked the idea of wrapping it with the shelving, and it just became this object kind of within this new. So the juxtaposition of those things, again, not erasing, but more like a palimpsest for the idea of the library. And again, the hope would be there's another iteration that they're able to evolve and adapt this space. So downtown Brooklyn Cultural District, someone asked me earlier, architecture is not kind of a quick profession, and that's an understatement. It is not instant gratification because this project is 13 years and going. So 2 more years. If you're familiar with downtown Brooklyn, there's this little sliver of a triangle, Flatbush, Ashland, and Lafayette, not far from Barclays. Barclays is the larger object just south. So before I left to start my small firm for a period of time, we had just won an international design competition to build the Brooklyn Visual Performing Arts Library here. Unfortunately, that was never funded, but in our minds, this was always a civic cultural space. This project, like the library, the site was sold to a developer that created the public-private partnership, and in turn, the developer was to provide 50,000 square feet of cultural space. So one thing to note, again, what you can do is not always what you should do. So we could fill this entire triangle, extrude a very large building. I can't remember now the zoning, because again, that was 10 plus years ago, but basically a very tall tower to the property limits as of right, meaning we didn't have to go and seek special city planning approval. But for us, again, because of our mission and also because the way the project started, this wanted to be a civic space. If you're familiar at all with Flatbush Avenue, it's highly trafficked. There's really not many places to pause and be in this space. So for us, while a private developer purchased the property and hired us because we had past experience with the property, they wanted a private residential tower. We came to them and said, well, you can get what you want, but we think the site requires something else. So what we proposed was, and here's that triangle, as slender a building as could possibly structurally be and still fit the program. And in doing so, again, we create the solid to actually define the void. We were able to create this open public plaza. The idea being that Flatbush would never be the generous boulevard, at least now, but again, you're always designing for, I guess, kind of a hopeful, aspirational future. But the idea that we would take the public realm, fold it up, and give the public this free, accessible, public civic landscape. Now, we made a very compelling case to the developer, and you have to understand, again, your client is still your client. You're hired to provide for them what they need, and what they needed was a residential tower and some retail. So we have to acknowledge the fact that they're not just going to kind of give up the public space unless we can give them a compelling reason to do so. One of the compelling reasons is obviously, in the development world, it was always about how close were you to Central Park. There's the value, and anything that radiates away from Central Park is of lesser value. Now, obviously, that has been completely decentered with a lot of the, the High Line, Hudson Yards, and many of the other developments since then. But it gets to the heart of it, which is people want to be where other people are. And people want to be where they feel like they're at the crossroads. They're at like some significant center. And so our proposal was to say, well, if this becomes the new kind of center of downtown Brooklyn, this new kind of cultural heart, you would get that. In addition to that, we knew we still had to provide 50,000 square feet of space for the cultural entities. Now, if the fact is that the retail really wants to kind of take up the ground, it wants to be on the street, it needs to be on the street for the developer. But the other problem is if you were to take the cultural entities and put them, just faceless in the base of the tower, again, there are the Alvin Ailey Dance Studio and all these amazing cultural entities that unless you've ever popped up on the 4th floor of one of these buildings, you probably don't even know they're there because, again, their name is just simply on a plaque, at the front. So what we said was, cultural entities, these not-for-profits, it's hard enough to exist, but if you cut off their accessibility, their visibility, then we're kind of setting them up for failure. So we realized that by folding up the public, we could actually bring the public to them, and that we could create this as kind of a new elevated storefront, which again would dispel this idea of kind of a mall condition. So what we proceeded to do was to stack the library, and this is the Brooklyn Academy of Music cinemas, performing arts studios, and rehearsal dance spaces, and stacked them up. And while there is a cultural lobby that you can go to, take an escalator or a stair or elevators to go, our preferred, and hopefully the public's preferred, will be to actually traverse up this public plaza and access it directly from the street. So this is an image of the plaza. And why it's taken 13 years is because we were introducing the plaza and because we were making the building so narrow to kind of create that public space, it was not as of right. We had to go through a ULURP, which is basically a revision to the land use, and that took 3 years just to get through that process. This is kind of at the prow, at the point of the triangle, again with the expression. Even the retail was about really kind of folding the public space in. If you're going to be in New York City, in a space in New York City, you should feel like you're in New York City. I'm assuming we're all here because we love the city or we love urban environments. And I think that's very critical to kind of identifying kind of an authentic placemaking. And this is a view across, so you see the plaza. For us, we recognize the tower, and even the tower, we always saw it as really not residential, but really a cultural building, which is also why we faceted it and kind of created, this is a very monochromatic metal that picks up on the lights and the ambient colors of the neighborhood, always trying to, in many ways, dematerialize the tower, because for us, the project really was those first 4 levels. And throughout the entire process, it was under construction. The residential tower is actually built and occupied. Throughout this, because even though we were fighting for this new civic landscape, even though we were fighting for where the culturals would go and their presence on the street, we actually never met with any of the culturals because they weren't our client. Our client was the developer, and in fact, they weren't even sure who those cultural entities would be since we were looking out so far in the future. I think for us, the most gratifying thing about this project is we interviewed for the job to work directly with the cultural entities. We were hired, and now what we're doing is we're working with Brooklyn Academy of Music, MoCADA, which is a local visual arts gallery, 651 Arts, which is performing arts in Brooklyn, and the Brooklyn Public Library, to fit out all of their spaces. So again, project's not quite done. We still have about 1.5 years of construction. But these are some views of the galleries. The wonderful thing, and here's the library, the wonderful thing about having all the culturals together is we and this is also too, where does design begin and end? Yes, we're always asked to design the building, but I think the most important thing is first designing the process. If you don't have a successful process, you won't have a successful building. And so at the beginning of this, I made it very clear that we would work as a collective. I know each of them had their own interests, and especially when a lot of them are not-for-profits, they have a limited amount of money, and kind of time is short, money is short. But by working together, I know it's a cliche, but it really did become greater than the sum of its parts, because they started this interesting cross-fertilization by which the library decided it would not be a small branch library. It would not just be kind of the repository for books that serviced that immediate neighborhood. They would embrace this idea of the performing arts and the visual arts, and their collection would reflect what was going on in the galleries, what was going on in the cinema, the film, whatever film was showing, and it would become more like a production studio by which people could come and record their own work. They had this notion of like the human book. And again, the idea, we're so far past libraries used to be where they were very highly curated. Your thoughts were only validated if, that book was authored and published and put in that library. Now again, there's this free exchange of information and of ideas. And so this will really be more similar to this space. They'll have lectures, they'll have discussions. Other people will come and share their work either openly or intimately within the production booth. And then again, they could even leave it there for others to engage with. So it was really wonderful how each of the groups kind of embraced what the other brought to this space. And the CASITA. So if anyone's familiar with the New York Restoration Project, I don't know if Bette Midler started it, I believe, in the early 90s. It first started with her recognizing that the community gardens had a lot of trash in them. She would bring groups together, pick up the trash, try to maintain the gardens. I think it became very clear to her that the city did not have the resources to maintain the gardens, so she raised the money to purchase 50 plus of the community gardens that then their New York Restoration Project would maintain. Still public, still servicing all the, it was just a matter of who would maintain them so that they remained the amazing resources that they were. So this is Willis Avenue in the Bronx. They came to us, and in most of their gardens, they have what's called a CASITA, which is kind of a small structure that typically promotes. They'll use them for lectures, they'll use them to play dominoes. They're really just a touchstone for the community. The reality is they'll use them however, just a simple kind of hut structure, and it just is something that I guess works very well with open community gardens because it gives people just a sense of place within the neighborhood. Willis Avenue, it's pretty amazing. They produce, and I don't even remember, thousands of pounds of fresh produce a year, and they really do supply quite a lot of it to the immediate neighborhood. Many of the more elderly residents, the only fresh produce they get comes from this garden. So it really is kind of this wonderful resource. They came to us and said, would you do this project for us, pro bono, design the CASITA? And of course, we were very flattered, to be able to help them. But we soon realized that, well, what would you do the next time? And they said, well, I guess we'll go to another architect and ask them to provide their design services pro bono. And that would be the next time, and that would be the next time. And so again, we realized the question was not design a CASITA for Willis Avenue, because they were such an empowered group. They worked with the community, they maintained the gardens, they built they grew this produce, they programmed the gardens. So what they really needed was a way to do this themselves. So our proposal back to them was, well, no, we won't design it per se. We'll design this kit of parts such that it'll be a modular system, and when you get to the next garden, you'll be able to tweak it and listen, you'll sit down, you'll work with the community, they'll tell you what programming they need, and then you'll use this kit of parts and you'll go, from garden to garden. So we broke it down into really what were the basic needs. The basic needs were really to keep the weather off of them, It was also flexible enough such they could address many different site conditions within the garden. It had to be something that was clearly of a certain scale to promote kind of public use. And because the gardens do not have an address, and there's an interesting kind of quirk in the code, which is if there's no building, then you can't bring utilities to it. So this had to be off the grid. So we had to find other means of bringing power and water to the site. So we identified kind of this kit of parts, again, thinking more like IKEA. If we could give them this brochure by which it could put, although, you have to be honest, IKEA is not that easy to put together. But, but the idea was they could pick what sizes they needed. And with that checklist, know immediately how many screws they needed, how many boards they needed, of what length, of what thickness. And it would be just this very kind of accessible. Because again, the other projects were about physical accessibility. This is about accessibility to resources and really accessibility to your own community, to realize that you really didn't have to reach outside to provide for yourselves. And of course, there's always the prototype. So we went through it. We had some bumps, certain things where we had to make changes just to ensure that people could, in fact, build it themselves. And this was 3 of the modules, because for this particular garden, they wanted kind of a bandstand. They wanted also big enough for a classroom, for the dominoes, for yoga. They do have a lawn, and they have the community gardens. Our hope is that in the future, we do have water coming to the space, because the roof itself and the adjacent roofs, we talked to the neighbors and are actually gathering water from the adjacent roofs to bring to the drip line irrigation. They just secured funding for photovoltaic panels that will go on top that will provide the Wi-Fi connection, because the other interesting thing about the gardens is they were losing some of the generations. They were losing some of the different age groups, but by bringing Wi-Fi, they could actually bring the community back. Sometimes it's the invisible systems that are the most powerful. And then the wood is also just about kind of providing shading, but also allowing the air to permeate through. And again, we gave them a piece of infrastructure. You could call this architecture as public place, public space. You could call this architecture as territory or architecture as infrastructure. We would hope it's maybe a little of all 3. But more importantly, they improved upon it. It was just a starting point. And they've really embraced it. And again, it really just becomes an armature by which they create their own identity. So it wasn't, the question was, will you design a pavilion? Will you put kind of your brand on this structure? And ours was, how about we just give you the tools to create your own? And I'm happy to report that since then, they've actually built, I think, 2 more in 2 other gardens. So that's working. MUNET, this is in Mexico City. This is the only one that's still in design. Again, we were asked to design a museum for energy and technology adjacent to what is the largest urban public park in Mexico City. And similar to Acapulco, the struggle was really, you can justify bringing a resource, but we can't justify taking one away. So we did not want to bring this object in the middle of the park or even adjacent to the park and potentially take away from what is already this thriving, vibrant public space. This shows the evolution of that park. And you can see just how amazing it is within the context of Mexico City. So the density of Mexico City required that we not take 1 square inch of this park. In fact, what we decided was, what if the challenge was not how little we can take away, but how much we can add? So our proposal was actually, and again, this was adjacent to the park, what if the museum was entirely underground and that we extended the park? So we actually extended quite a substantial percentage of the park itself. And the idea really being, because again, if the museum, you don't have to pay. So there's already this notion of accessibility, but what we found with cultural entities, there's still a hurdle. So many people don't use museums. So many people don't go to galleries. Why is that? Is it the financial hurdle? Is it a social hurdle? Is it one of education where people feel they don't know enough to kind of enjoy the exhibits? Sometimes it's just a matter of like not feeling like you're at the right place at the right time, or being presented or even almost confronted with the opportunity. So and again, going to what I started with, how do you weave, even though this is technically a public program, still there's some sense of private program when you come to a museum. You know, it does not seem like a full extension of the public realm. So we really wanted to figure out some way in which we could stitch this seemingly private and public space so that it really did promote this absolute porosity. So, we just really started to look at how we could embed the museum program itself within the landscape and create this new topography, this new landscape with the museum. This is an aerial of that proposal. The idea being that if you've come to the park, you might come and witness the outdoor water features. You might come and hear a concert in the open amphitheater, and then in doing so, start to find your way into the interior museum itself. And similarly, if you come to the museum, start to kind of trickle out through these different kind of perforations out into the park. So again, hoping that one kind of influences and reinforces the other. The other thing too is, we really embrace all of the disciplines. Our structural engineers, mechanical, acoustical, lighting, sustainable, they're collaborators. We don't come up with an idea and then tell them, make it work. Because then, you're working against yourself, it's gonna cost more, and it's just not gonna be successful. So we really, worked very closely with what is the rational structure? How does this topography not only encourage this public-private interconnection, how does it capture rainwater? How could we promote, the idea of reducing the heat island effect? How can we use by cutting very strategic moments in the landscape, bring in natural light that actually is conducive to museums as opposed to detrimental where most kind of block them out. So each one of these is a direct response to all of the feedback from the consultants. And here's a section through. I know I'm kind of glossing over the program, but again, it's a science and technology museum. The other important thing is that, first and foremost, this is, a platform for education and for exposing, especially the youth of Mexico City, to the possibilities of future in energy research. So again, it was important that this park that was so well utilized, we could fold, those different age groups into and hopefully expose them to something that might change their life. And you can see, again, off of the street, and again, trying to stitch it, you're always building a piece of the city, whether it's a CASITA and it's 10 by 30 feet, or whether it's 300,000 square feet. You're always building a piece of the city and how you can stitch that in and make it this meaningful impact, and again, a catalyst. In the interior, you start to see kind of the focused daylighting, and this is the planetarium. And this is actually one of my favorite moments, this idea that the building kind of literally integrates itself within the landscape, and you start to understand how that program spills out, and this really does become that moment by which the park and the museum kind of come together as one collective audience. Thank you.